In World War II, the Eastern Front was hell on earth. Cold, brutal, and unforgiving. No battle captured the sheer madness of it all like Stalingrad did. This wasn't just about conquering the city, this was about destroying Soviet morale, taking a city named after their leader, Joseph Stalin. As we know, Stalingrad was an absolute meat grinder, the bloodiest battle in history, dragging on for over 6 brutal months with a Soviet victory. But that makes us wonder, what if Germany actually pulled it off and took full control of the city? Stay with us as we dive into how Germany could have won Stalingrad and what kind of ripple effect that would have had on history. To better understand why Stalingrad was so important, we'll start with a quick recap of what actually occurred. By mid-1941, Germany was on the move in the east. Their main goals were to destroy communism, create Lebensraum, a living place for the German people, and gain key resources in the region. But between them and achieving these goals stood one major obstacle: Stalingrad. So, in the summer of 1942, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, the Germans rolled in with the 6th Army. On the Soviet side, General Vasily Chuikov and the 62nd Army were tasked with holding the city at all costs. And that's exactly what they did. Stalingrad turned into a nightmare. The Soviets fought like hell, turning every street, every building, and every basement into a death trap. Germany was able to secure vast portions of the city, but then something happened. Winter came. That's when the Soviets sprung their trap called Operation Uranus in November 1942. This plan called for Soviet forces to smash into the flanks of the German 6th Army. Hitler had overextended his forces, relying on poorly equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops to hold the flanks. Cut off from supplies, freezing and starving, Paulus and the 6th Army held on for 2 months before surrendering in February 1943. This marks Germany's first major defeat of the war. But what if that never happened? What if the flanks were better protected? Could this be the potential turning point for this alternate scenario? Let's rewind a bit. Winning Stalingrad wasn't impossible, Germany just made critical mistakes. Instead of getting bogged down in brutal street fighting, they should have encircled the city and cut off Soviet supply lines, forcing a surrender without urban combat. The biggest failure was underestimating the Soviets. Hitler believed the German people were a superior race, and the Soviets weren't smart enough to mount a successful counteroffensive. Had Germany reinforced those positions with experienced troops and mobile reserves, they could have blocked the Soviet assault and held their ground. Another point would be blitzkrieg. In Stalingrad, Germany stalled. More tanks, concentrated artillery, and tighter logistics could have overwhelmed Soviet defenses before winter hit. Instead of wasting time fighting over ruins, the Germans should have seized key industrial zones, secured rail lines, and locked down the Volga. Even if Germany pulled it off, the war wouldn't have ended there. So, what would happen next? With the city in German hands and the Volga under their control, the Soviet war machine would have been in serious trouble. We can expect Germany would have begun pushing south into the Caucasus. Oil fields in this region under Germany control would have left the Red Army running on fumes. No fuel for tanks, no gas for trucks, and no way to keep their war effort going at full speed. With a successful push into the Caucasus, Hitler wouldn't have to keep pouring resources into a fight that was dragging Germany into a war of attrition. Instead, he could have turned his attention back to Moscow. The 1941 push on the Soviet capital had nearly succeeded before the brutal winter and stiff Soviet resistance forced the Wehrmacht back. But in 1943, with fresh reinforcements and fewer distractions in the south, Germany could have launched a renewed assault. This time with far better odds. Stalingrad's fall would have meant more troops, more tanks, and a chance to deliver a knockout blow to the heart of the Soviet Union. And let's not forget Leningrad. The city had been under siege for nearly 900 days, and despite the Soviets suffering many losses, they held out. But if Germany hadn't gotten trapped in Stalingrad, they could have thrown more forces at Leningrad and crushed it once and for all. Without the southern front sucking up manpower, the Wehrmacht could have tightened the noose, forcing the city to starve or surrender. With Moscow and Leningrad gone, the Soviet leadership would have been scrambling, and Stalin's grip on power might have started to slip. And what about the Western allies? They were already nervous about the Soviets collapsing. A German victory at Stalingrad would have made that fear very real. The US and Britain might have had to accelerate their plans for D-Day, or worse, consider opening up a second front in the east to keep Germany from completely steamrolling the USSR. That means a chaotic and desperate shift in Allied strategy, all because Germany managed to pull off a win where it mattered the most. And then we can't forget about Japan. In this alternate scenario, we could also create another turning point, asking the question, what if Japan held on a bit better against the United States, or never decided to attack Pearl Harbor? Perhaps with some coordination between Germany and Japan, the Japanese could have benefited from Soviet oil in the east, which they desperately needed for their military. The Japanese had been eyeballing the Soviet Union from the east for a while, but never made a serious move. If Germany had put Stalin on his heels, Japan might have finally invaded from the Pacific side, forcing the USSR into a two-front war, one they probably couldn't win. So what would the aftermath of a Soviet collapse look like? Even with a win at Stalingrad, Germany still had problems. They were stretched too thin. The war in North Africa, the bombing campaign from the Allies, and the eventual American entry into Europe meant Germany was still fighting on multiple fronts. The war might have dragged on much longer. Maybe Germany holds on to its eastern conquests, forcing Stalin into a defensive war for years. Maybe the Allies are forced to negotiate a separate peace treaty on Hitler's terms, finally creating his vision of Lebensraum. Instead, the Germans lost. Paulus surrendered, and from that moment on, the Red Army started pushing back hard. If the Germans had seized Stalingrad, history as we know it would have been altered beyond recognition.